Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone. That is Arabic for peace be with you all. I'm Imran and today we have an iPad 10.2 which died suddenly according to the customer and there is no power. Now from experience I know that it is usually a problem with the CPU. This one I've tested already and it is the CPU. As you can see, we've already separated the motherboard. We're now gonna go ahead and reball the CPU. So let's get started. The first thing that we're going to do is use our knife to carve out the epoxy from the edges so that we don't damage any components around the CPU. Now that the edges are cleaned from the epoxy, let's take this cap off to make some space for our spudger knife to take out the CPU. Now you have to be very careful while removing the CPU. Too much heat can damage the chip. Too low heat can damage the pad of the CPU. And make sure not to pry it off. Now that the CPU is off, it's time to add some low melting point leaded solder to clean off the pads on the logic board. Once we have done that, we will then use our wick to clean them off. Adding the leaded solder just makes it easier to clean up. Alright, now that we have wicked our pads, we are going to use our cleaning knife to get rid of the rest of the epoxy and to make the surface and the pads nice and smooth, ready to take the reballed CPU on. You still have to be careful with the knife, it can damage the pads, which we do not want. Don't get me wrong, if any of the pads do break, we can rebuild them, but that becomes a tedious and a very time consuming process. So better safe than sorry. Now that we have cleaned up the epoxy, we're just gonna use the good old IPA, isopropyl alcohol, 99%, nothing less, with a brush to clean off the flux. Let's put that aside now that it's been cleaned up, and let's start with our processor. Now we're gonna do almost the same process as we did on the logic board to clean all the pads, but we need to be very careful while cleaning the CPU itself, because the pads on the CPU are a lot more delicate than the pads on the logic board itself. So, as we did before, some low melting point leaded solder, Alright, so let's add some flux before we go wicking. That will make cleaning our pads a lot easier and smoother. Now that the pads are all wicked, let's go ahead and use our cleaning knife to remove the epoxy. And we are gonna be very careful while doing so. Okay, so by the time the UV mask cures, let's go ahead and check our stencil, make sure there's nothing stuck in the holes so that we have nice and shiny balls on our processor or the CPU. Alright, so with our CPU rebolts perfectly, let's get our logic board back. Now, before placing the CPU on, we're going to apply a little bit of a flux and preheat the logic board as well, so we don't have to apply too much heat on our CPU. Okay, so we have successfully reballed and replaced the CPU. Now we are going to wait for the board to cool down before we go ahead and try turn it on. Okay, so let's go ahead and put our logic board back into the chassis and see if it is working or not. Alright, so there we go. As you can see, we have a fully working iPad. Touch is working fine. Let me show you if it is the same board, which it is obviously. And this is how you fix an iPad 10.2, 2018-2019 models, which have died suddenly for no reason. As always, I hope you learned something. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.